Exercise 1. A diverse garden will become a habitat for a variety of bird species. But if all the birds were to sing at the same time, each one's melody would be drowned out in the cacophony of voices. In order for each singer to be adequately appreciated by his rivals or his sweetheart, each species focuses on a specific time in the morning, or rather not a time, but a certain position of the sun. These are relative to sunrise, a precisely definable event. Unfortunately, it changes constantly, as throughout spring the sunrise takes place a little earlier each day, until the summer solstice on June 21st, when it starts getting later again. So, birdsong is perhaps not ideal as a genuine replacement for your watch, although each species tends to observe its relative time slot, day by day, with astonishing accuracy. Exercise 2. With reference to the variable of intensity, it is almost stating the obvious to say that bright lights or loud sounds can attract our attention. We have all been exposed to countless examples of commercial advertisements that seem to be based solely upon this premise. One unusual example of the use of intensity in advertising contexts is the practice of time-compressed speech in radio commercials. The experiment conducted by La Barbera and McLaughlin exposed people to 5 radio commercials that were either normal or time-compressed on the order of 130%. These time-compressed commercials were not sped up by making the tape run faster. That would also increase the frequency of the auditory signal and make the announcer sound like a high-pitched Mickey Mouse. Rather, the time compression technique involves the shortening of pauses between words and the reduction of the length of vowel sounds. This results in a message that runs more quickly, without changing the pitch of the announcer's voice. These researchers found that the time-compressed advertisements elicited more interest and better recall than the normal ads. Exercise 3. Recycling means recovery and reprocessing of waste materials for use in new products. Recycled waste can be substituted for raw materials, reducing the quantities of wastes for disposal, as well as potential pollution of air, water, and land resulting from mineral extraction and waste disposal. However, recycling has certain limitations when applied to radioactive materials. Due to their inherent radiation, radionuclides are much more difficult to recover from contaminated materials. Recovery usually presumes concentration of species into a smaller volume, even though this may result in more dangerous materials. Waste radionuclides recovered from contaminated materials are difficult to recycle in new devices or compounds. Hence, even materials that contain large amounts of radioactive constituents, example, sealed radioactive sources as used in industry, medicine, and research, often are immobilized, conditioned, and safely stored and disposed of rather than recycled. Exercise 4. Glass affords transparency. At the same time, its physical structure blocks the passage of most physical objects. As a result, glass affords seeing through, but not the passage of air or most physical objects. Atomic particles can pass through glass. The blockage of passage can be considered an anti-affordance, the prevention of interaction. To be effective, affordances and anti-affordances have to be discoverable, perceivable. This poses a difficulty with glass. The reason we like glass is its relative invisibility, but this aspect, so useful in the normal window, also hides its anti-affordance property of blocking passage. As a result, birds often try to fly through windows, and every year numerous people injure themselves when they walk or run through closed glass doors or large picture windows. If an affordance or anti-affordance cannot be perceived, some means of signaling its presence is required. Exercise 5. In cultural contexts that require polite formulas rather than honest words, language may lose almost all its communicative function, and here food often takes over the role. In formal dinners around the world, it is not usually appropriate to send the important social messages verbally. Words are bland and carefully chosen. More information about the actual social transactions going on at the dinner is transmitted by food choice and distribution. The most valued guest often gets the choicest portion, and so on down. Other aspects of the ritual may communicate even more. Everyone carefully observes who sits next to the host, who sits at the host's table, who is the first one to be greeted, who is served first, who gets the best piece of meat, or who is urged to have seconds. Exercise 6. Ritualistic behavior designed to influence future events is not, it seems, limited to humans. B.F. Skinner's classic research into superstition in the pigeon, conducted at Indiana University in 1948, supports this hypothesis. Skinner described an experiment in which pigeons were placed inside a box and were presented with a small piece of food once every 15 seconds, regardless of their behavior. After a few minutes, the birds developed various little unusual rituals, such as walking round in circles, moving their heads up and down, and so on. The pigeons appeared to have concluded that their little routines were causing the release of the food, even though in reality there was no relationship whatsoever. Skinner's explanation for this phenomenon was that the accidental pairing of the release of food early on in the process with whatever the bird happened to be doing was enough to reinforce that particular type of activity. Exercise 7. Within the domain of concrete entities, objects and substances have very different properties. Objects are individuated, whereas substances are non-individuated. Thus, the two kinds of entities have fundamentally different criteria for the notion of identity or sameness. When we say that two objects are identical or the same, we are referring to two objects in their entirety and not to two distinctive parts of a single object. In contrast, when we say that two substances are identical or the same, there is no notion of wholeness. Substances are of scattered existence, and there is no such thing as whole sand, whole water, or whole clay. This portion of sand is identical to that portion of sand, as long as the two portions consist of the same physical constituents. This difference in identity or sameness between objects and substances leads to fundamentally different extension principles for determining category membership across the two ontological kinds. Exercise 8. Although the efforts to revive dying languages are admirable, the challenges facing those who would reverse the extinction process are intimidating. Not all of the extinctions are the direct result of hostility and repression from a dominant government, as was the case with the American Indians throughout most of U.S. history. But where brutal repression failed to make indigenous languages and culture extinct, intense globalization since the 1980s has been more successful. The recent revolution in communications technology has provided powerful tools, through the airwaves and cyberspace, for the spread of mainstream Western culture and language. Yet, for some endangered languages, the tide is changing through the digital revolution. As Rosenberg points out, digital technology, discussion groups, software companies, and apps are lifelines for language preservation for minority and endangered language communication needs. At one time, technology forced some language speakers to adopt the dominant language of their community or nation. Now, new tools create the possibility for revitalizing languages and retaining language speakers of endangered languages.